It was supposed to be just another art class, a routine lecture, some basic techniques, and a simple exercise for the students. But the moment Liam walked into my studio, my world flipped upside down. At 45, I had built a life of structure, order, and quiet ambition. But in that single moment, when a 25-year-old golden-haired man with chiseled features and a body sculpted like a Greek god stripped down to pose for my students, I knew nothing would ever be the same. This is the story of how I, Daniel Brooks, an art professor, fell head over heels for the man who became both my muse and the love of my life. I had been teaching art for over 2 decades, and though I loved my work, the spark of inspiration had grown dim. That was until a colleague suggested hiring a model to liven up my students' creativity. The suggestion seemed harmless enough. I agreed and contacted an agency, requesting someone with an inspiring presence. When the agency sent Liam Carter, I didn't realize what I was in for. He walked into the room wearing a simple white t-shirt and jeans, his golden hair catching the sunlight streaming through the studio windows. His confident stride and easy smile captivated the entire room. My students murmured among themselves, but my throat went dry. For the first time in years, I felt nervous in my own classroom. As he greeted me with a firm handshake, I tried to compose myself. "You must be Liam. Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Happy to help," he replied, his voice smooth and calm. But what I wasn't prepared for was the way my heart skipped when he added, "Where should I get ready?" The studio was buzzing with anticipation as Liam stepped onto the platform in the center of the room. The students, their sketchbooks ready, whispered to one another about their excitement for the session. I stood by my desk, organizing supplies, pretending to focus on anything other than him. But the moment he began to undress, the entire room seemed to shift. It was as if time itself paused. Liam started by pulling off his t-shirt in one fluid motion, revealing a chest so perfectly sculpted it could have been a masterpiece in itself. His skin was golden and smooth, with just the faintest sheen of light catching on the curves of his muscles. The strong lines of his shoulders gave way to his defined abs, each ridge of his torso highlighted under the warm studio lights. My breath caught in my throat. I had seen countless models before, but none of them had affected me like this. Liam wasn't just beautiful, he was magnetic. He looked around the room, seemingly unfazed by the attention, and then his eyes met mine. My heart skipped a beat. His gaze was steady, confident, and disarming, as though he was perfectly aware of the effect he was having. Not just on me, but on everyone in the room. "Where do you want me, Professor Brooks?" he asked, his voice as casual as if he were asking for a glass of water. I struggled to respond, my voice betraying the calm professionalism I prided myself on. Just on the platform. Take whatever pose feels natural," I managed to stammer. He nodded and removed his jeans, revealing legs that were just as impossibly well-defined as the rest of him. Clad only in a pair of fitted black briefs, he climbed onto the platform with the grace of a panther. Every movement he made seemed intentional, fluid, almost hypnotic. The room grew quiet save for the sound of pencils scratching against paper as my students began to sketch. But I stood frozen, unable to look away. As he settled into a reclining pose, his body angled toward the light, I felt a pang of something I hadn't experienced in years. Desire mixed with awe. His outstretched arm rested above his head, highlighting the taut lines of his biceps. His legs were bent just enough to showcase the strength in his thighs. But it wasn't just his physique that captivated me. It was the way he held himself, exuding both power and vulnerability in equal measure. The students whispered among themselves, marveling at their good fortune to have such an extraordinary model. I overheard one of them say, "He looks like a god." Another replied, "No, he is a god." I couldn't blame them. Liam's presence was otherworldly, and for the first time in my career, I felt jealous of my own students. They could focus on their art while I was utterly distracted. I forced myself to walk around the room, glancing at their sketches. "Good work," I murmured to one, though I barely registered what I was looking at. My focus kept returning to Liam. His breathing was steady, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt hypnotic. Every inch of him seemed to radiate warmth and life, and I couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to touch him, to trace the contours of his body with my own hands. As the session continued, my thoughts grew more chaotic. What was I doing? I was supposed to be the professional, the mentor, but the pull I felt toward Liam was undeniable. It wasn't just his looks. It was the way he carried himself, the ease with which he became the center of attention without even trying. He was a living masterpiece, and I was already losing myself in his orbit. When the session finally ended, the students clapped for Liam, who smiled and thanked them graciously. He stepped off the platform, grabbing his clothes from the nearby chair. As he dressed, he caught me staring. Instead of looking away, he smiled. A small, knowing smile that made my heart race. "Thank you for today," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "It's been a while since I've modeled, but this was refreshing." I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "The students loved you. You were incredible." My words felt inadequate, but they were all I could manage. His smile widened. "I hope I'll see you again soon, Professor." And with that, he was gone, leaving me standing there, my mind spinning and my heart pounding. I knew in that moment that I was in trouble. Liam Carter wasn't just a model. He was the spark I had been missing in my life, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant. The days following Liam's modeling session were a blur of restless thoughts and stolen moments of reverie. My studio, which had always been a sanctuary of discipline and creativity, now felt haunted by his presence. Every corner seemed to echo his laughter. Every beam of sunlight reminded me of the way it danced on his golden skin. I had told myself 1,000 times that it was unprofessional to feel this way, yet my resolve crumbled with every passing hour. My students, oblivious to my inner turmoil, were equally enchanted by Liam. Their sketches and paintings were some of the best I had seen in years, bursting with energy and passion. "He really inspired us, Professor," one student said as she showed me her work. Her words hit me like a revelation. Liam hadn't just inspired them, he had ignited something in me as well. By the third day, I found myself dialing the agency again. My excuse was simple. The students needed a follow-up session to refine their work. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. I wanted to see him again, to feel that same electric charge that had coursed through me during his first visit. When the agency confirmed Liam's availability, I felt a wave of excitement and dread. What was I doing? This was supposed to be about art, about education. But as the hours ticked by, I knew it had become something far more personal. On the day of his return, the studio buzzed with anticipation. The students eagerly set up their easels, their chatter filling the air. I, on the other hand, was a bundle of nerves. When Liam finally arrived, wearing a casual button-down shirt and jeans, the room seemed to brighten. His smile was as disarming as ever, and I felt my pulse quicken. "Back for round 2, he said with a wink, his voice carrying that same effortless charm. "Yes," I replied, struggling to keep my tone neutral. "The students were really impressed with your last session. They've been looking forward to this all week." Liam chuckled, his eyes scanning the room. "Well, I'll do my best not to disappoint." He began unbuttoning his shirt, and just like before, the room fell silent. This time, he chose a standing pose, one hand resting on his hip while the other held an imaginary object. His muscles shifted subtly as he adjusted his stance, creating an interplay of light and shadow that was mesmerizing. My students were captivated, their pencils flying across their sketch pads. But I could barely focus. All I could see was him. As I walked around the room, pretending to critique the students' work, I couldn't help but steal glances at Liam. His body was a masterpiece, yes, but it was his presence, his quiet confidence that truly held me captive. He caught me staring at one point, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. My face burned with embarrassment, but he didn't seem to mind. When the session ended, the students reluctantly packed up their materials, many of them asking when Liam would return. As they filed out, I stayed behind, gathering my thoughts. Liam, still in his pose, stretched his arms and let out a contented sigh. "That wasn't so bad," he said, stepping down from the platform. "You make it look effortless," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He approached me, his movements unhurried. "Maybe because I enjoy it," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Or maybe it's because of the way you look at me." The air between us grew charged, his words hanging there like a challenge. My heart raced. "I don't know what you mean," I lied, but my voice betrayed me. Liam tilted his head, his gaze piercing. "Don't you?" He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. But just as quickly, he stepped back, his playful smirk returning. "Thanks for having me again, Professor. Let me know if you need me for another session." And with that, he left, leaving me standing there, my thoughts in disarray. That night, as I lay in bed, replaying every word, every glance, I realized I was past the point of no return. This wasn't just admiration or inspiration. This was something far more dangerous, something I couldn't ignore. The days following Liam's second visit were unbearable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, the curve of his smile, the way his muscles tensed and relaxed under the studio lights, and the way he seemed to see right through me. It wasn't just his beauty that haunted me. It was the undeniable connection, the unspoken tension that hung between us. My focus on teaching faltered, and my students began to notice. "Professor, are you all right?" one of them asked as I fumbled through a lecture. I forced a smile, brushing off their concern, but inside, I felt like I was unraveling. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see him not as a model or a muse, but as a man. My heart pounded as I dialed his number, the one he had casually written down after the last session. When his voice answered, smooth and warm, I almost lost my nerve. "Liam, it's Daniel. Professor Brooks," I stammered. "I wanted to thank you again for the last session. The students have been raving about your work." "Happy to hear that," he replied, his tone laced with amusement. Was there something else you needed? There was a pause. This was my chance to retreat, to keep things professional. But instead, I heard myself say, I was wondering if you'd like to join me for coffee sometime, to discuss future sessions. The silence on the other end felt endless. Then he chuckled, low and rich. Coffee, huh? Sure, Professor. When and where? We met at a small cafe near campus, a quiet spot tucked away from the bustle of the city. I arrived early, nerves twisting in my stomach as I waited. When Liam walked in, dressed in a fitted sweater and jeans, I felt my breath hitch. He looked effortlessly stunning, and I suddenly felt self-conscious in my worn blazer and tie. Professor, he greeted, sliding into the seat across from me. Or can I call you Daniel now? Daniel's fine, I managed, though the sound of my own name in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. We talked about art at first, his experiences as a model, my years as a professor. But the conversation quickly grew more personal. He told me about his life, his dreams of becoming a photographer, and his struggles with self-doubt despite his confidence on the outside. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years, sharing stories about my career, my failed relationships, and the loneliness that had crept into my life as I grew older. As the hours passed, the tension between us became impossible to ignore. His gaze lingered on me a little too long, his smile a little too knowing. When he reached across the table to brush a stray crumb from my sleeve, his fingers barely grazing my arm, my heart skipped a beat. Daniel, he said, his voice softer now. Can I ask you something? Of course, I replied, though my pulse quickened at the look in his eyes. Why did you really invite me here? His question hung in the air, heavy and charged. I hesitated, the truth clawing its way to the surface. Because I couldn't stop thinking about you, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You've awakened something in me. He leaned back, a small smile playing on his lips. I was hoping you'd say that. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. We lingered at the cafe long after our cups were empty, the space between us shrinking with every passing moment. When we finally left, the air outside was cool and crisp, but I barely felt it. Can I walk you to your car? He asked, his voice filled with warmth. I nodded, too stunned to speak. As we reached my car, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. Daniel, I think you're incredible, but I don't want to make things complicated for you. Complicated? I echoed, my heart sinking. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine. I can see how much this means to you. I just want to make sure you're ready for it. His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. He wasn't rejecting me. He was offering me a choice, a chance to step into something new, something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I am, I said, my voice firm. I don't want to let fear stop me anymore. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in and kissed him. It was tentative at first, a soft brush of lips. But when he responded, pulling me closer, the world seemed to disappear. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The kiss lingered in my thoughts long after I drove home that night. Every sensation, the warmth of his lips, the faint scent of his cologne, the way his hand had gently cupped the back of my neck, played on a loop in my mind. I was a man of logic, someone who always approached life with caution. But Liam had shattered that part of me, replacing my calculated restraint with a burning desire I couldn't suppress. The next day, I stood in my studio staring at the empty platform where Liam had posed. My students had moved on to other projects, but I couldn't. His absence was palpable, like a missing piece of a puzzle I couldn't complete. My phone buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. It was a text from him. Liam, last night was amazing. When can I see you again? I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The logical part of me screamed to slow down, to think this through, but my heart had already made its decision. I typed back quickly. Me. Come by the studio tonight, after class. When Liam arrived that evening, the building was quiet, the students long gone. He walked in wearing a leather jacket and jeans, his golden hair slightly tousled. He looked different somehow, more relaxed, yet just as magnetic. My chest tightened as he smiled at me, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Am I interrupting? He asked, his voice low. Not at all, I replied, trying to steady my nerves. I wanted to show you something. I led him to the back of the studio, where I had set up a canvas earlier that day. It was still blank, the paints untouched. I thought maybe you'd like to collaborate, I said, my voice hesitant. You inspire me, and I'd like to see what we can create together. Liam's smile widened as he stepped closer, his fingers brushing mine as he reached for a paintbrush. I'd love that. We worked side by side for hours, the studio filled with the soft hum of music and the scent of paint. He was a natural, his strokes bold and confident, yet precise. I found myself stealing glances at him, captivated by the way his body moved, the way his eyes lit up with excitement. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same color, and I froze. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. Daniel, he said softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. You've been looking at me like that all night. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. Like what? Like you want me, he said, stepping closer, the paintbrush falling from his hand. I couldn't deny it anymore. Because I do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He closed the distance between us in an instant, his lips crashing against mine. This kiss was different from the first, hungrier, more desperate. His hands slid up my arms, pulling me closer as I melted into him. The canvas stood forgotten behind us as we gave in to the passion that had been simmering between us since the day we met. We stumbled back, his strong hands guiding me against the wall. His lips trailed down my neck, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as my breath came in ragged gasps. It was electric, consuming, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. When we finally pulled away, both of us breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. I've wanted this since the first day in the studio, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Me too, I confessed, my heart pounding. But it's risky, for both of us. Liam cupped my face in his hands, his eyes searching mine. Some things are worth the risk. That night, as we lay tangled together on the studio floor, I realized just how much my life had already changed. Liam wasn't just a fleeting passion. He was the spark I hadn't known I was searching for. But as the hours ticked by and reality began to set in, I couldn't ignore the questions that loomed on the horizon. What would this mean for my career, for his future, for us? For now, though, I chose to focus on the present, the warmth of his body against mine, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the quiet promise of something beautiful. The following weeks were a whirlwind of stolen moments and hidden glances. Liam and I fell into an unspoken rhythm. Late night visits to the studio, shared cups of coffee, and quiet conversations that lingered long after the world had gone to sleep. But secrecy came with its own price. Each time we left the safety of our bubble, I felt the weight of judgment pressing down on me. My students started to notice my distracted demeanor, and whispers began to circulate. Liam, ever confident, seemed unbothered, but I couldn't shake the fear that our fragile happiness might shatter. One evening, as we lay together in the studio, Liam turned to me, his expression serious. "Daniel, how long do you think we can keep this a secret?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm not ready to let you go." He smiled softly, brushing a hand through my hair. "Then we'll make it work, no matter what." The tension grew as whispers around campus turned into pointed stares. Liam, carefree as ever, brushed them off, but I couldn't ignore the risk. One day, as we shared a quiet moment in the studio, he placed a hand on mine. "Daniel, they'll talk no matter what." "Let them," he said, his voice steady. I nodded, torn between fear and the undeniable pull of him. "I just don't want to lose you." "You won't," he whispered, leaning in to kiss me. "I promise." The rumors reached the administration, and I was confronted. The choice was clear: end it or face consequences. That night, I told Liam everything. "Let them do what they want," he said, holding my hand. "I'm not losing you." I nodded, finally ready to stand by him no matter the cost. I resigned the next day. Liam and I moved to a quiet town, trading the chaos for a life of love and art. Together, we built a studio, our sanctuary, and embraced the freedom to love without fear. In him, I found my masterpiece. Hey, did you enjoy today's story? Let us know in the comments what you thought and give it a rating from 1 to 10. If you have a story to share and want it to become a video, feel free to tell us in the comments too. Thank you for sticking around until the end of the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another exciting story. See you next time.